Hey everybody, thank you for joining me on another episode of Regulatory Voices. Today I'm really excited to be joined by Nataskia Lampe. Nataskia, thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you, Connor, for having me.
Nataskia, it'd be great if you could tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your background, your journey, a nice high level, and then we'll kind of break into it as we're going through all the topics.
Sure. So I've been in the industry for over 20 years now, primarily in regulatory affairs, but I've also ventured into asset strategy and pipeline strategy roles. So my regulatory affairs journey has been across the gambit in terms of working with primarily strategy, but also along the lines of doing some Reg CMC and operations and also just global regulatory affairs in general. So I'm more of a generalist with a strong strategy piece.
Fantastic. And one thing I wanted to start with as our first topic is your kind of non-linear journey into regulatory, because you did go through different ways of kind of building up to it. So if we could start at the beginning, tell us how you got into regulatory, because your journey definitely isn't as linear. It was built bit by piece. So if you could tell us that journey.
Well, my regulatory journey started with me taking on a job no one wanted to do. So I was a laboratory technician at Children's Research Institute in New Orleans. I was happy, doing research in type 1 diabetes. We would use cadaver pancreas to test patient serum as a predictor for type 1 diabetes. At the time, they needed someone to take on this role as a laboratory compliance officer. I had no idea what that entailed, but I figured it's something to add to my resume. I'll learn something new. Well, that crazy decision led me to taking a few compliance courses and attending conferences while on the job and independent learning about compliance itself. So I started meeting people in the pharma industry as a result of being in certain spaces and realized there's this whole world on regulatory and compliance that I knew nothing about. I was a research lab associate and doing my thing there. So when I attended graduate school at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, the curiosity really peaked as some of my professors also worked in the pharma industry. I took on courses such as IRB compliance because, I'm like, hey, I know a little bit about that. That's where I learned about ethics and drug development. And one of the things I noted during my coursework at Jefferson was the unmet need in patient populations, whether it be based on specific ethnic groups or specific rare disease populations that pharma simply left behind. So I used my own family history of autoimmune diseases for my master's thesis and focused on a familial study of autoimmune diseases prevalence in a Caribbean and Latin America family based on HLA gene sequencing. I was fortunate at the time that I was working in a transplant laboratory in Philadelphia and was allowed to conduct the research in the HLA lab there.
Hmm. Fantastic. And I know you talked a bit about you started doing some consulting with some ex-FDA people, and then that kind of brought you into what regulatory is, and then you kind of went into that pathway. Can you tell me a little bit about that as well, how that
Yeah.
came about?
So I'll take you back a little bit before that. So one of my first jobs after graduate school was actually working for the Department of Defense in DC. I was a clinical trial associate at Walter Reed Medical Center in a HIV natural history trial. Following that role, I did work briefly for an IRB for a major hospital healthcare company in the DC, Maryland area, MedStar Health. I'm not even sure if MedStar Health is still around, but I suppose they are. So I was also a clinical trial associate then, but I again raised my hand and stepped into the role of compliance officer for the IRB. And in that role, I had the opportunity to review every single clinical trial proposal as prepared by the proposal packages for the IRB members to review. This taught me what good looks like and what IRBs deem as risky.
Mm-hmm.
When I moved into the consultancy role, that was with a company in Bethesda, Maryland, and that small consulting company was started by ex-FDA reviewer. So I was working alongside former FDA reviewers, which this really solidified my interest in regulatory affairs as I learned firsthand from professionals who knew how the FDA thinks and how they make decisions and why they make certain calls that may at times be unpopular within pharma.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned, you started out as a lab technician and it was a job that no one else wanted. What did taking it, though, teach you that you don't think you could have learned elsewhere in your journey?
One of the things that you're going to probably hear me say today a couple times is that this mantra, I guess, that I live by, and that is everything you've ever wanted is on the other side of fear. And with that, just volunteering to do something different and take you out of your comfort zone is a journey in itself. And it really helps shape, who I am, and not being afraid to be uncomfortable in certain situations.
That's a great saying, that one. I really like that. Everything you wanted to be is on the other side of fear. I think it's something I agree with as well. If I think back to all of the pivotal moments of my life so far, it's always been after a big scary step, something I wasn't sure if it was the right thing, or there was a lot of anxiety behind it. And every time there has been no regret, and sometimes I think people do get a little bit stuck behind the fear of a what if, and that can hold people back. And I think that's a really positive way of just putting it simply.
hmm
So I appreciate that. So I want to talk about a little bit when you first actually got into a regulatory affairs role. Tell us, what was your first job where regulatory affairs was in the title?
So I was working for, my first job where regulatory affairs was in the title was actually with the consulting company, where I was a regulatory affairs project manager. So I learned a lot across the board in a very short time, because I was working with different clients at different phases of development. So some I was, learning how to file an IND. Others, I was working with clients that needed, more advanced support in terms of going to an end of phase 2 meeting or pre-NDA meeting and such. So that role really culminated in terms of solidifying my interest in regulatory affairs, and really taking me to the next level, as I learned all of this in a very short period of time. And as I mentioned, I was working alongside ex-FDA reviewers. It's like, it doesn't get any better than that.
Of course. I'm wondering if there was a specific moment or point where you realized regulatory affairs is where I want to be, and not just something that I'm trying out. Because obviously, if you look at your journey, you have done so many different things with the lab, grad school, with IRB, consulting. Was there a specific moment where you went, this is where I want to be and what I want to be doing?
You know, I think it's a culmination of all of those experiences that solidified my interest in regulatory affairs. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment, but there was all of these moments that led through multiple experiences that led me to regulatory affairs. I would say just working alongside ex-FDA reviewers really solidified it, because then I learned firsthand from professionals who knew how the FDA works, and who was able to also guide me in terms of, this is what's important and why it's important. It wasn't just about the bottom line, but it was more so understanding how the FDA thinks. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, my next question was going to be, what did you learn from those formula regulators, and on how the other side of it works? It sounds like you kind of got it there. It's how things work, what things mean, how to interpret them. Was there anything else that you learned that really stood out to you, or was a key lesson when working with these ex-FDA people?
Is to really know your audience. Depending on the division and depending on who your reviewers are, you really have to put together your strategy, your packages that you're going into a meeting with. You really have to know your audience. So it's about understanding what's important to that audience, understanding how each division thinks about their therapeutic area. And, that's just something that, that to me at this point is regulatory 101, but at the time it was groundbreaking.
And something I did want to ask you is, it's very common that people, go down the college route of doing a master's, PhD, join a big company, and then take advantage of all those trainings they have, and then go smaller company. Because your journey is quite different, non-linear. You're in that different bracket where you actually started out in smaller environments
Mhm.
before ever really getting into big pharma. So for you, what does that sequence, small first, big later, mean for how you developed as a regulatory professional? Because it's not the common journey.
Yeah. So the smaller companies allowed me to wear many hats at a very early stage of my career, without that judgment and political nuance you find in big pharma. The smaller companies where I learned the sequence of events in a very short time. However, I transitioned to big pharma, ingrained in me that enterprise view of processes and the importance of subject matter experts. Sure, anyone can read the regulations and follow it to the letter, but the subject matter experts bring a depth and breadth of experience that brings more strategy to the conversation. It's never black and white in regulatory, and it's the nuances that builds strategy and interprets the success of one drug over another. But there's the benefit for both small and big pharma. They both want to develop the next breakthrough that will turn standard of care on its head, but the approach differs in regards to the level of in-depth strategy from start to finish. I can truly appreciate for both the get it done and the slow and steady approach. It's about meeting patient needs, right? While strategically gauging competition and risk tolerance, you have to find a way to marry the asset level view of a small pharma and an enterprise level view that you usually get with big pharma. Because usually your small pharma, you have one or two assets where all of your energy is going into it, and you're really taking on that asset level view. And then in big pharma, there's so many different assets, and each of those assets have its own place in the enterprise perspective of the success of the company. So really taking that on in terms of understanding where you look at things at the asset level versus the enterprise level.
If you could go back, having gone through the journey you've gone in now, do you think you would have kept the journey the same, or would you think you would have liked to have started in a big company and then gone to a small company?
No, I would definitely keep it the same in terms of going to the small company first, because it did allow me to wear those different hats. And I walked into a big company understanding the roles better. I know some people who started with big companies and, they have somewhat of a narrow view in terms of, this is the lane that I'm in versus really understanding how all of the aspects work into that.
Yeah. I think from my experience with working and sourcing, recruiting people in this profession, the ones who have gone to smaller companies and having done work with big companies as well, it does really fill out some of the blank spots in their areas where before you kind of get, this is what you're doing for this product, your lane, work with these other groups and these SMEs to get what you need. Whereas when you go to a smaller company, it does fill in those gaps that then make you into more of a complete regulatory profile. I think you have to get to where you want to be, say a VP or a leader, you have to have had both versions of it. Because like I said, they've both got the same goal, they're both doing the same thing. It's a matter of resources and capability. And exactly, those things you have in front of you.
Mhm.
One thing that I quite liked that you used in some of our discussions over the last year was the phrase cross-pollinating in regulatory affairs. And it came across quite clearly how you thought about regulatory as not just a single function, but as a role that touches everything from CSE, clinical, legal, quality, and asset strategy. And you've generally worked across all of those. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on, going deep into those functions whilst keeping regulatory lens at the center. And so my first question to you is, regulatory is touching all these areas, and you've described it as a double-edged sword. You're across everything, but it can feel like you're a jack of all trades at times. How do you think about and manage that tension?
Yeah. So the jack of all trades is exactly the right terminology. It's the best way to sum it up. You become that old saying of a jack of all trades, but a master of none.
Correct.
You have to dive deep as needed, but also rely on subject matter experts at certain points, right? And it's not always true for smaller companies. Quite often, regulatory may become the subject matter expert in some instances. One example of this is when I worked for a small company in Maryland. There was no Reg CMC role. When CMC issues came up that needed regulatory input, I had to immerse myself within the CMC team and really get to know CMC from that perspective. So in this particular instance, it was so evident that I was so immersed in CMC, not even Reg CMC, but CMC. My VP at the time asked me, "Do you want to join the CMC team? Is that where you want to go? Is that your next step? We can move you to North Carolina." So naturally, I declined that role, but I did immerse myself enough to become the Reg CMC expert at the time. It wasn't a permanent thing for me. Throughout my career, I've had to do this in similar thing in areas of clinical quality, even legal. During that point, I had not been exposed to big pharma and all the different multiple subgroups of regulatory and SMEs that exist out there. So it was perfectly normal in my mind. It's like this is what I have to do to get my job done. So I immersed myself in different areas and worked alongside whoever I had to work with.
Because you came from a research background, you said that before that gives you a lot of comfort being in the grey area of you're not
Hmm.
quite sure how things are going to end up. How has that influenced the way you approach regulatory problems compared to, say, people who come from a quality or a legal background? Because those profiles do exist.
Yeah. What I've learned over the years is that regulatory professionals come from so many different walks of life, and we each bring a perspective, right? The most important thing is our individual experiences, whether directly applicable to regulatory or not, is we find comfort from our science background, from our legal background, or whatever other field they're bringing to the table. So, just like most other functions, I've used my internal and external experiences to build and develop strategies in regulatory affairs, to be able to have the conversations, the scientific conversations, and simplify that for everyone to understand. And I think that's a key piece in regulatory, to be able to turn complex information into simple information for everyone from every walk of life to understand. And I think that's one of the places where, the science background, I'm not intimidated by the language by the technical language that may be used, but I internalize that and ensure that it's applicable and also easily digestible for anyone.
You talked before about, when you're in these smaller companies and you've been wearing those hats and you embed yourself in the team. I wanted to see, what does it actually take to do that without losing your core regulatory perspective? As you
Mhm.
said, you were in CMC, you were really in that group where people said, do you want to join that group? So how do you, there's people out there who are having to do that right now. How do you immerse yourself in that environment whilst maintain the regulatory perspective? Because essentially, with by working with all these groups and cross pollinating, as you say, you always have to maintain your basis. So how do you do that?
It it really takes confidence in your ability to learn and adapt. It takes finding comfort in uncertainty, allowing yourself to be vulnerable and exposed,
Hmm.
not being afraid to ask questions. There's SMEs, in your presence. Utilize them. You have to be comfortable in deferring your usual quick responses to saying, I need to do more research on that topic, or asking more questions of your colleagues. Comes down to taking on those roles where you're not always sure of everything and finding comfort in that uncertainty.
I think that sounds quite similar to when you told me about your role at AbbVie, where you moved from being the global regulatory lead into an asset strategy role, if I remember correctly. And I
Yes.
think you were telling me about you then had a regulatory expert reporting to you rather than being the expert yourself for the first time.
Hmm.
Would you say it's that confidence? Was that the thing you needed to have to make that transition work, or was there more to it?
Absolutely. I had to let go of being the regulatory go to person on the team. Yes, I'm knowledgeable about regulatory topics, but I didn't have to be the one to have the answer. It actually felt good to some extent. Regulatory can be somewhat opinion based at times in terms of interpreting things. So I had to keep an open mind and listen to the regulatory expert on the team and allow that person to utilize their own experiences and their opinions. Now, that didn't stop me from respectfully challenging them or questioning their thought process. But most importantly, it was about keeping an open mind for the success of the team and having those debates, whether it's within the team or if it's a one on one debate that I felt like needed to happen.
I want to take a bit of the journey you've done so far and can link it to some of the conversations I've had before and
Hmm.
kind of put ourselves in the shoes of people who are in their careers right now. There's a lot of discussion about the difference between big and small companies, and we've discussed a little bit about the access to materials, SMEs. One thing I don't think there is too much discussion on is the difference in health authority interactions. And as someone who, again, you started small, so you were front and center with these interactions, as opposed to where people were in big companies and aren't usually in the room just yet.
Hmm.
I wanted to explore that side of things. So my first question to you would be, having worked both sides, what would you say is the most significant difference between the two environments that people on the outside don't fully appreciate?
So, one of the things that I appreciate about small companies is the most prominent aspect is decisions are made quickly, and so
Yes.
is course correction. I appreciate the more direct impact that my voice will have in a small pharma. However, the melding of minds at a large pharma is certainly a bonus. The number of subject matter experts and their experiences are so valuable in so many instances. But I don't know if this is generally true, but I've noted in my experiences with FDA and such in small pharma seems to have an advantage of the agency providing a bit more hand holding and guidance versus big pharma. The agency really has high expectations of perfection and strategy. They have the expectation of a well vetted and thought out strategy from both segments. Don't get me wrong. It's not like,
Hmm.
they're letting small pharma, run wild. But I've noticed in my experiences that there's a bit more forgiveness in small pharma than in big pharma, especially when the leadership team in a small pharma is primarily academically focused. But the expectation from the agency for a big pharma is that you've got your stuff together, you have enough resources. If you don't have it to get it together. And I think there's a bit more of a higher expectation there from the agency.
I think it's good to highlight that, because I don't think that's something that is kind of mentioned or has any sort of light on it. And to be honest, you kind of do want it to be that way, because
Yeah.
the academic guys, the guys who are doing 10 years of research, trying to, you've got this product
Hmm.
that's their baby, they're trying to take it to market.
Yeah.
They're crowdfunding for the first time. They're doing their first investment rounds. They don't know who to trust. Kind of do need that support from the agency of what do we need to do to make this happen, because that's where, especially in today's let's talk about our merger and acquisitions,
Hmm.
a lot of the new exciting products is from these smaller companies who are
Exactly.
actually spending the time doing it, as we're seeing these big
Hmm.
companies kind of move away from the R&D side of things. So
Hmm.
it's good to highlight that, especially for people who are unsure about joining a smaller company as part of their regulatory career, understanding that there is partnership there is going to support, and
Hmm.
not the expectation of, I say, a bit top 10 who, as you say, should know what they're doing at this point. I want to take a little bit pivot into credibility. And in a smaller space, as we said, you don't have the infrastructure, no templates, no precedent, no specialized people. How do you build credibility internally and with the agency, and build momentum in those environments when you're starting from scratch, when there is none of that there already?
Your credibility comes from knowing your capabilities and your limitations, knowing when you need help, and knowing what you're capable of. So driving a team towards goals with a keen eye on inflection points that will alert you to you need additional headcount, you need external resources, you need to bring in, a subject matter expert here or there. Really, that's where your credibility comes from. There's no expectation, at least in my mind, and more often with some of the leaders that I've worked with, there usually isn't an expectation that one person knows everything. It's just impossible, right? But that person should also know when it's time to bring in additional resources or headcount or a subject matter expert for certain discussions. So it's really knowing your capabilities and also being fully aware of your limitations.
And would you say that's the most important lesson you learn from small companies when you were going to a big pharma setting? 'Cause it kind of feels like that would be a very key skill to have.
Yes, yes. Because even in big pharma, it's thought of quite often that the small companies they use consultants and so forth. They don't have the money for consultants,
Yeah, yeah.
so you have to be very careful in terms of when you're bringing in a consultant and which consultants you're bringing in. Big pharma use just as many consultants, which that was a surprise to me, frankly, going into big pharma. They use just as many consultants, and they have the money to use those multiple consultants. on a single project.
I want to kind of go back into the room a little bit. When you go into an FDA meeting as a small biotech versus going in representing a large company, what actually changes? Is it just the size of the team in the room, or is there something more fundamental to it? As you say, is it there's more of a open discussion as opposed to a bigger company, or is
hmm
there more?
hmm Oddly enough, I think the size of the team in the room is about the same. However, the decision makers in the room is what I've noticed. Smaller companies, of course, will sometimes bring in the CEO or similar levels to meetings. This allows quick decisions within the meeting, whether that's a good or bad thing, because I've seen it go on both ways. So the pivot is almost immediate, within some of those meetings. While big pharma most always takes decisions under advisement and bring topics back for internal and more in-depth discussion. So the people in the room is what really changes from the sponsor side. The sponsor, can change the dynamics of that meeting by bringing certain people, whether it's decision makers. But I've also had the experience where going into an FDA meeting, knowing that there's certain challenges on the table and the team had already vetted what decisions they would pivot to if the agency pushes back. And I mean, that's happens, of course, with big pharma. But then the FDA can throw a curveball. They can throw a curveball. You always have to expect the unexpected. And if they throw you a curveball in those meetings where the team just did not, was not prepared for that curveball, oftentimes those are the things that have to be taken back. So, the typical answer is we'll take that under advisement and we'll bring those topics back internally for discussion.
Hmm.
Whereas with a smaller company, sometimes those curveballs get answered on the spot, which may or may not be good.
It's yeah. When I try to picture what those environments look like, that's the one thing that comes to mind. It's the big companies like, yeah, okay, we'll take on board. We'll go back and talk back, kind of like a politician's
Yeah,
answer. You're not really
exactly.
answering the question. Whereas smaller, I can imagine it's like, yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah,
We will do
exactly.
this. Yeah. I wanted to ask, as someone who's done a lot of work, not just in the US, but globally as well, how do you adapt your approach depending on who you're representing? Because the different companies will have different strategies and relationships with global authorities.
The approach is very similar. What's important is that, as I stated earlier, to really know your audience, you have to do your homework on who you're talking to, the meeting attendees. You search online for interviews, conference presentations, AdCom participation, even looked at search social media links to see what people are liking and so forth. This gives you that glimpse into what's important to the regulatory authority that you're meeting with. It helps you anticipate and prepare for the unexpected, just talked about. And that was actually much more difficult to do years ago when I started in regulatory over 20 years ago. Now everything is at your fingertips, right? That was much more difficult to do back then. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying to stalk FDA reviewers, just to clarify. But, paying attention to what's important to them, what conferences they're attending. If you're there, definitely go ask your question. That's your opportunity to ask some difficult questions with no commitment, no obligation.
Yeah, yeah.
And usually they're going to say they're not representing the opinion of FDA, but rather their own. But their own opinion is what feeds into that. So it's important information.
I think there's a relatively safe assumption from people that bigger companies have an advantage with regulators because of track records and resources.
hmm
Do you think that's true? Or do you think there's something that is in favor of smaller companies sometimes?
I think it goes back to, what I explained earlier in terms of there is that advantage of having a track record if that track record is good, right? You could have a negative track record with them as well in terms of, not always following their advice and kind of going rogue and doing your own thing. And even in those situations, sometimes it works out for the sponsor. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does. Because at the end of the day, the data speaks for itself. The data speaks for itself. That's what's going to matter from the FDA or any other health authority perspective. So there is that advantage in terms of having that track record, having that relationship with the agency, but also there's the the element of that passion that the agency I think can pick up on, where you're
Hmm.
dealing with more smaller companies with an academic focus. And I think that's what gives the smaller companies the advantage, because it's truly more scientific discussion that the agency wants to engage in. Versus with the big pharma, yes, it's a very scientific discussion. I'm not saying that it's not, but there's also that perception of this is big pharma and they're worried about the bottom line.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
A hypothetical question for you. Let's say I'm a director of regulatory affairs at a big company. I've been working in this area for 12 years now. I've never worked at a small company, and I've just got a VP role at an early stage company. What would you tell me to be ready for? What should I be prepared for?
Be prepared for the unexpected. You know, the attraction of small companies is dealing first and foremost with the unexpected. A lot of small companies are really, you know, laying new ground in terms of their approach. So you may not always have that precedence to draw back on. You will definitely have to lean in to all of your experiences and the experiences of your colleagues from big pharma. You know, forget about the endless resource expectation behind and be ready to truly innovate to get things done. The benefit of coming from big pharma are the learnings, though. I learned from my own experiences, but also from the experiences of others. In big pharma, you have a lot of governance meetings. While you're sitting in those governance meetings, you know, waiting for your turn to present, you're listening to other teams across different therapeutic areas. So if you're not picking up those learnings, then you should be. You should be picking up those learnings on, you know, what other teams are doing across different therapeutic areas and applying those across the board. So that vast big pharma experience could be helpful in a small company as well, because you're really going to be looking for the unexpected. You have to be ready for anything. And you have to be ready to wear many hats. You're not going to be just regulatory. It just never happens.
It's good. It's good to ask that though, because I think as you know, as the industry keeps developing, and we've now got people who are, you know, rather than falling into regulatory, they're aware of it from their time entering into college. People are doing regulatory,
Yeah.
the masters, and you know they're doing RAP certifications and whatnot. There is now an idea of what regulatory is very early on, and so people are getting to these big companies and doing their pathway, which is a unique system that didn't really exist, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And when there is time to make that switch, it's good to have this sort of information, because some people just won't know, because the journey that most people do doesn't seem to happen as much anymore. There's a lot less I fell into it, and now it's a lot more of I knew about it whilst I was at college. So it's good to cover these points. But Nataskia, we've actually come towards the end of the interview. So we've got 3 quick fire questions for you.
Sure.
So tell me what comes to mind. So the first one's going to be, what career advice do you wish you had received earlier?
I'm going to go back to one of the things I started with. Everything you ever wanted is on the other side of fear. Raise your hand for that high profile project that will put you in the room with the leadership team at times. You don't have to know everything. You just have to know how to find it.
Great answer. If we had this conversation again in 10 years' time, what do you think will have changed the most in regulatory affairs?
I know this is a hot topic everywhere, but it has to be the use of AI in assessing regulatory probability of success. One of the questions that regulatory professionals get all the time is, what's the regulatory probability of success? That question is so nuanced and so many factors goes into it. It's almost an endless cycle of, you know, if, ands, and buts. So with the use of things like agentic AI platforms, you can actually see the patterns across not just a specific indication, but more in depth across therapeutic areas and even by FDA divisions more clearly than, you know, the days of manually doing endpoint assessments, competitive analysis, and jumping to conclusions without knowledge of all the nuances that may trigger a positive or negative decision. So the use of AI, you know, recently I was back in March, I believe, I attended a RAPS conference, and the entire conference was about AI. So it's not coming, it's here. But using AI in those circumstances of just assessing regulatory probability of success, I think it's going to change the way we do regulatory.
And lastly, what part of working in regulatory affairs do you enjoy the most?
In a broader sense, it's, you know, working to bring a solution to patients, especially those diseases or populations where I mentioned during my grad days that I realized there were gaps in understanding certain populations, certain diseases, those high unmet needs. We learn so much from clinical trials, whether they're successful or not, it's always a step in the right direction, right? So definitely that broader sense is just working to bring solution to patients. In my day-to-day, the cross-pollination that we talked about would definitely be something that I enjoy. Being able to jump from one subject to another while still applying regulatory knowledge, building strategies and leading the teams. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that's everything I've got. Nataskia, thank you very much for joining me. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. This was great.
Good. For everyone who's watching, feel free to connect and reach out to Nataskia if you want any questions you want to follow up on. I'm sure she'll be happy to engage with you. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next show.
Yes. Thanks, Connor.